Good afternoon from Norway, and I believe whoever are around the world, there is a different time zone here. So today we have a very special day for our students in international relation. They are going to learn more about non-Western philosophy, non-Western thoughts, conception, cosmovision, that is relevant, theories relevant for international relation. And today we have come so far that we have covered most of the South Asia, and also before we have also covered a lecture on African contribution to international relation, particularly Ubuntu, concept of Ubuntu. And today we'll have a lecture on relevance of Nelson Mandela's thought philosophy for international relation in this rapidly changing world. And I will introduce myself and Stig Jarle Hansen about the background of our esteemed presenter today. Dr. Ismail Lagardien is a columnist on South Africa's most important newspaper and an external examiner of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. He was previously executive director of business and economic science at Nelson Mandela University. Before that, he worked in the Secretariat of National Planning Commission in South Africa Presidency from 2011 to 2015. He taught at the University of South Carolina and Elon University in North Carolina, 2005 to 2011. He was educated at the London School of Economics and hold a PhD in international political economy from University of Aberystwyth before. And then before starting his PhD in 2001, he worked in the office of Chief Economist of the World Bank. And then in the 1980s and early 1990s, he was a photojournalist, which is my favorite kind of things that I'm very fascinated to look at different kind of photos and political correspondence. Since he is also a very good friend of our program coordinator of IR program at this Norwegian University of Life Sciences, I would like to first say a few words. Professor Stig Jarle Hansen, if you are still there.
Yeah, I'm very happy
Please turn on your video.
Yes, I'm very happy to have the chance to introduce both Bishal's class to Ismail and Ismail to Bishal and Ismail to all the dear students who attend there. The idea about the module that you're a part of is that we try to get a balance of in international relations. So we introduce non-Western views and non-Western theories. Very often you see non-Western empirics being included, and the theory field has kind of been limited by kind of Western dominance. And I'm also happy to have you here, Ismail, because Ismail was part of the struggle against apartheid. To me, he's actually a kind of a hero. And it would be very interesting to hear your voices also in relations to the context that I talked about now. So that's all I have to say. Yeah.
Thank you, Stig. So today we'll be covering about Nelson Mandela, who was born in South Africa on 18th July 1918. I was born in 19th July, so one day before me, but long ago. And he went to prison for 27 years for fighting against the apartheid. And then we'll hear more about him, about his life and legacy. But he was also, of course, renowned apartheid activist, politician, statesman from South Africa who played a significant role in the country's transition to democracy and its engagement with the international community. In terms of IR, international relation, Mandela's contributions are multifaceted and have been analyzed through various theoretical frameworks. His advocacy for human rights, democracy, and economic development, as well as his emphasis on reconciliation and forgiveness, challenged dominant norms and beliefs and helped to shape a new international discourse around peace building, conflict resolution, and social justice. Moreover, his emphasis on dialogue, negotiation, and diplomacy in promoting peace and resolving conflicts highlighted the importance of multilateralism and cooperation in international relations. So, overall, our STEAM scholar today will talk a little bit about Mandela's legacy in his own way, and also how he was promoting more peaceful, just, and equal world for all nations and people. He may also cover that, yes, during the time of fight, during the fight of independence movement, different kind of fight against injustice, Mahatma Gandhi, many other becomes heroes. But later on, when their idea, their concept, their thoughts, their cosmovision is not followed, how the nations again remain, beyond that, not following those aspirations. So with these words, I would like to now invite Ismail to give his presentation. The word is yours.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I'm actually surprised and quite humbled by the kindness. Stig is just unbelievably, I don't recognize the person he referred to there because I'm just an ordinary regular person. But let me thank you for inviting me and make a couple of introductory sort of procedural points. We have 11 minutes ago at 2 o'clock our time, and I think your time, we had the start of a 4-hour period of blackout. So we go through these sometimes up to 4.5, 5 hours of without electricity. I have a backup system, so my electricity source is fine. So there's a chance that I may ask for a 5-minute break should anything go wrong. But there is a regular stream of electricity now because I have a continuous, it's called a continuous power unit. So there shouldn't be a problem. The second point I want to make is there are conventional IR theories, political science theories, and political economy theories that that can help the students understand what it is that has been going right, that went right, and what it is that went wrong. My experience, the greatest influence of my work comes from critical realism and critical theory, and I hang on especially to what I think Horkheimer said, that the objective of critical theory is to uncover, to remove surface forms of equality, to reveal the concealed injustices. So that's where that's my starting point. And just as anecdotally, perhaps a bit more information, when you hear me speak of when I mention growth and things like that, I don't consider these as ends in themselves, because you can have as much growth as you like, you can have much inflation as you like, you can discursively, as constructivists might say, you can talk about democracy, justice, social relations, social justice, but it means nothing material. It might amount to very little materially. So there's constructivist literature that you might want to tap in. And then there are a couple of texts that I'd like you to that I draw on. The one is Robert Putnam's two-level game. Now, that's quite simply put that you cannot, to understand a country's foreign relations, you have to understand the way that country plays what's called a two-level game. So you look inward at what your domestic requirements are and your regional requirements are, and then you project outside policies externally. So it's that two-level game. That's a very sort of conservative, in my view, conservative view, but it's also very conventional. And there is Susan Strange's a little bit more enlightened view. Susan Strange was one of the founders of my discipline, International Political Economy. She wrote first a paper and then a book called States, Firms, and Diplomacy, and how this triangle of states, companies, and diplomacy work together. Now, the missing element there, I think, is civil society as an actual actor. So you might, want to look at that just to guide the thinking. And then, of course, there's the role of the emancipatory role of critical realism. And there are a couple of important papers there that you might want to look at, one of which is by Milja Kurki and Heikki Patamäki. And so you look at their work and you'll find a lot of what the intellectual influence is. So those are some of the opening remarks. And again, let me apologize if, and I don't think it'll happen, but if there's a sudden break, but there shouldn't be a break in transmission. But if I have to run to the door or anything, I'll just say that. But I want to start with the opening remark is that Nelson Mandela's foreign policy, or his ideas about the world in which we live, began, as it were, immediately after his release from prison. So to the extent that it was possible, and it certainly started shaping, in the early 90s, he began to express views. He took his message of nonviolence, reconciliation, support for human rights, and democracy to the world. So he did a lot of traveling in that first period. And I had the privilege of traveling with him as a journalist to very many countries between 1991 and 1993. So I traveled with him on these press trips from around the world and with F.W. de Klerk. And Mandela's views were driven by, Ubuntu, the idea that we are, I am because you are, and that we have to see ourselves in the context of humanity and not as isolated from it. But it took his message was that one of nonviolence, reconciliation, support for human rights and democracy, and later on, gender issues. We must remember that Mandela went to prison before what we've come to know as the 60s, the feminist or the women's liberation movement. So he carried with him some very outdated concepts and probably offensive. I remember a comment he made early on when he said in the early 90s, when he said, we African men like our women strong, something to that effect, which is quite, offensive. So, but he changed. But that change is very important because, so he inspired an activist foreign policy agenda. This was premised on the belief that there is a necessary relationship between human rights, solidarity projects, and policies and politics, and rolling back the domestic needs of development, equality, and justice domestically. That is, so you have to reconcile these issues. But he also stressed the importance, at least initially, of resetting South Africa, in the sense that, now here's an interesting couple of references. There's a book called A Pariah State. it's not a very good book, but it's important. It's kind of important. It's a book by Antonio van Nieuwkerk. Basically talks about South Africa, Taiwan, Chile, and Israel as pariah states. So we can discuss that, or you can discuss that on your own. But the very idea that South Africa was a pariah state because of apartheid, and Mandela wanted to bring South Africa back. That's one book. What he started doing, and he started establishing a moral authority in the world, in part because of his struggle against injustice, and in part because of his reconciliatory tone when he came out of prison. So there's a paper called Moral Authority as a Power Resource. So you might want to look at that. I don't have access to academic papers from where I am working from home. And I also don't have more than, this position as an external examiner for university, so I don't have. But that paper should help you understand what it is meant by moral authority in a very practical policy in an environment where African countries are constantly at a disadvantage. And we'll talk about that a little later, where the problem there is that African countries and the global South, whether it's Nepal, Malaysia, Indonesia, Colombia, and Latin America, have been rule takers in the world. And there needs to be a transition to becoming rule makers. And I'll talk about that a little later. BRICS so far has been somewhat of a failure, but we can get to that some other time. It's important to the first, having spoken about the moral authority and establishing the moral high ground and the respect, when he became president. By the time he became president in 1994, on the 10th of May, Mandela had changed a couple of very interesting and very important policies. Now, if you remember, before he went to prison, he spoke about nationalizing mines and banks and industries the way most leaders in Africa, Latin America especially, spoke in the 50s and early 90s, with import substitution, nationalization, and so forth. So he spoke about that before he went to prison. However, when he was released, right, there became, so the statement he made originally was something like, the nationalization of mines, banks, and monopoly industries is a policy of the ANC. He reiterated that in 1990, after he was released, or before he was released, or at about the time. It's just he repeated that quite early. And a change or modification of our views in this regard is inconceivable. Remember that. He said Black economic empowerment is a goal we fully support and encourage, but in our situation, state control of certain sectors of the economy is unavoidable. So I'm going to read that again. The nationalization of mines, banks, and monopoly industries is the policy of the ANC, and the change or modification of our views in this regard is inconceivable. Black economic empowerment is a goal we fully support and encourage, but in our situation, state control of certain sectors of the economy is unavoidable. Now, let's fast forward 2 years. He's visiting perhaps Oslo, or was it Sweden? It may have been Copenhagen. Actually, it was Copenhagen, because I remember traveling with him. So on the 5th of February, 1992, or early February, Mandela had changed. He said that he was shocked by the response that business people abroad, mainly in Europe, had to his idea of nationalization. So this is the shock that developing countries have when they start interacting with the West. West is not a West in the European world, which are not cartographic realities. We're talking about North America, United States, continental Europe, Australia, New Zealand. So it's the what's called the WENAU, Western Europe, North America, and Oceania. So when poor countries go and meet these people, they often have to reel back their political economic, and I say political economic because even though I've had training as an economist, political economist, international political economy, I don't believe economies are disembedded from society. They're political economies. But when faced with the potential of withdrawal of investment or non-investment, Mandela said in February 1992, if we want to climate where investors will not fear losing their investments, we have to take a decision on the question of nationalization. We have to choose whether we want investment from foreign companies, and we have to make a choice. So that was a significant change in Mandela's domestic policy, or at least the ANC's idea on nationalization, on political economy, and how it played out and rubbed up against the West. So, in that's the way that when I mentioned earlier that African countries continue to be rule takers, once Europe and the main investors say, sorry, we can't do that, the poorer countries don't have much of a voice. So just by way, before I step on to the next issue, in 1985, South Africa's finance minister, Baron du Plessis, who was an apartheid, went to South Africa's foreign minister, Pik Botha, and he told him that South Africa was about to collapse. They have no money. This is the apartheid government, the last apartheid cabinet, the last white cabinet. By 1985, they realized the country was about to collapse. Now, we get then to the early 1990s, when Mandela was released, the African National Congress was unbanned, and the African National Congress began to look around the world and what is possible and what is needed. So there's the discursive element and the talk of emancipation and liberation, and then what constructivists will refer to as the material reality. So by the time the ANC came to office, the economy was on the verge of collapsing. Foreign direct investment was drying up. There was economic instability and volatility. The country verged on civil unrest, edging towards civil war. Hundreds, probably thousands of people were killed in conflict. There was the assassination 30 years ago last week of Chris Hani, which drove the country to the edge of complete political collapse. So you have the economic collapse, you have, putatively, so the economic collapse and political collapse. And Mandela then rose and became very much the leader above. He wasn't president at the time when he said to people in the country, addressed the society and said, throw your weapons into the sea. In other words, we can't go on fighting each other until we like. So there was this realization that you need stability, political economic stability, at the same time as expanding South Africa's external relations. So it was activist, it was ruled by a high moral authority, it was driven by the reconciliation of human rights, democracy, constitutionality, and political economics and development needs, which are very important. That kind of drove intellectually, or at least ideationally, Mandela's policies. One of the keystones, one of the cornerstones of his policy was to change South Africa's focus to Africa as a priority. Now remember, the Republic of South Africa during the apartheid year was essentially isolated from Africa. Mandela sought to reestablish that, to strengthen, and to encourage intra-African trade and closer relations. South Africa, the demands placed on South Africa by the African countries at the time was that South Africa had to provide political, economic, and intellectual leadership. That was the expectation from African countries. So you had to reestablish South Africa globally as a beacon of moral authority. You changed focus of Africa as a priority, the developing world, the political South as priorities. At the same time, the country needed to strengthen investment from traditional partners, that's Europeans, and also start expanding relations with countries outside of Europe. So that sort of set South Africa up in 1994, that vision. And that was what Mandela brought. So those thoughts, those ideas, and that kind of discursive element, this emancipatory politics, it was all very important for Mandela and all very important. But at almost every step of the way, there was resistance from the realists in the West, even from the liberals, the social democrats in Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and to some extent the Germans, were very conciliatory and understanding, and saw the need for market economy where there's a blended. So South Africa strengthened those relations while opening up furthering relations with countries like India, Malaysia. So remember, those countries disinvested from South Africa, broke off relations with South Africa in the late 50s and early 60s. So Mandela wanted to reestablish relations with those countries, just reestablishing relations with the global South, continuing relations with Europeans to get investment, and all the while trying to sort out things in the country. So the ANC won and became the government in 1994. Between 1994 and 1996, there was this work, and while foreign policies were starting to take shape, so remember there was a sunset clause, or sunset clauses factored into the political settlement. So South Africa held on to some of the old regime people, if you call it that, mainly the Afrikaners and white people, while bringing in new people. And there was an overlap. So there was constant tensions there between the old guard, who saw themselves as part of Europe, so the white people in South Africa thought themselves as Europeans, essentially, and the Africanization of the public service. So there were these tensions in the Department of Foreign Affairs and domestically, but let's not focus on that for a moment. So those first 2 years, then by 1996, South Africa, passed its democratic constitution, and that set South Africa on the path. With the world admiring South Africa, both for the peaceful political settlement, for the stature of people like Mandela, and the peaceful settlement was important. And now South Africa's constitution was regarded around the world as one of the best. So there's a constant, in the early time of Mandela, there's a lot of respect, a lot of admiration, and Mandela basically built on that. So a key development in 1996, one I'll just gloss over. South Africa hosted UNCTAD 9, which is United Nations Conference of Trade and Development. And it's very important to mention that, because here was one of the most important UN bodies being hosted in South Africa, and that was inconceivable for most of the previous 40, 50 years. But there was another moment which I think is very significant in South Africa's foreign relations, even though it wasn't a foreign policy or a foreign affairs appointment. It was the appointment of Minister Trevor Manuel as finance minister. Now, he immediately saw that the economy, political economically, South Africa was in a parlous state, and was driven mainly by this feeling of goodwill and charity, but there was really nothing to work with. So he began to stabilize the country's finances. He encouraged and promoted macroeconomic stability. Now, remember, these things aren't good in and of themselves. They have to result in something materially. But the West had essentially demanded or expected South Africa, as it became part of the international community, again, to sort of conform to conventions of macroeconomic stability, fiscal discipline, emphasis on growth, integration. But just to bear in mind, again, I'm going to stress growth is not an end in itself. Low inflation is not an end in itself. You can have low inflation. If it doesn't improve the lives of people, it doesn't matter. So, but nonetheless, Trevor Manuel went on to lead South Africa to become a member of the G20. And a decade, and then go back again. By the time he delivered his 10th budget in 2006, South Africa, remember, South Africa faced, in the early 90s, the political economy was in a bad shape. South Africa faced pressures from low commodity prices, investors' fears, and general Afrophobia. But South Africa and Africa was in a path to low growth, capital flight, and high inflation. But under Manuel's supervision, and partially under Thabo Mbeki, Mandela's successor, South Africa steadily started reducing its fiscal deficits, debt servicing costs, promoting several credit ratings upgrades. And by the time he delivered his 10th budget, South African budget deficit was 0.5% of GDP. Now, that's the lowest it had been in a generation, in 25 years. So you have then the appointment of Trevor Manuel, which resulted in the longest period of stability and growth in the country's history. But while Trevor Manuel and Nelson Mandela were respected around the world, the IMF, the World Bank, the Europeans, India, and various other places, inequality continued to grow. Poverty continued to grow. Now, just on the point of poverty, the overall level of poverty was reduced, but it persisted. So there's unemployment, inequality, these continued. It certainly showed in some ways, there's two levels to this, that economic policies on their own are necessary but insufficient. So you can have a lot of growth, but if there's no distribution to go with that, you're on a losing streak. So notwithstanding all that significant domestic and foreign, those achievements, by 2005, now, as I said, I'm skipping back again, a very important set of affairs took place within South Africa. Now, Mandela influenced Mbeki, but let me just reflect. When Mandela delivered a speech on South Africa's foreign relations at a gathering, I was there at the gathering, and I was working Mandela specifically said during his speech, "I don't know what we're doing in foreign policy. I am just told what to do and what to say." It was a joke, but it basically referred to Thabo Mbeki influencing Mandela's foreign policies later on. These are the actual policies, none of the sort of moral high ground stuff and the ethical stuff and the human rights stuff. Not that Mbeki was unethical, just in terms of cold policy, Mbeki influenced a lot of Mandela's thinking. So Mbeki became the next president after Mandela, and between him and Trevor Manuel developed South Africa's foreign policy. But they began to lose domestic support. Now, they began to lose domestic support, not among the elite. Let's just make a very crude, it's a fair statement. White people in South Africa tend to consider the economy as most important because they want to protect their assets. It's understandable. For the majority of people, it was enough that we had a black government and we were concerned about jobs, or South Africans were concerned about jobs, unemployment, housing, rolling back the spatial legacy of apartheid. So while the government had achieved quite a lot under Mandela with electrification, providing running water and housing, the country was basically increasing, inequality was increasing. So by the time South Africa gained a lot of respect internationally, there was a lot of dissent within the ruling party because they dismissed Ismail and Thabo Mbeki as neoliberals and who were obsessed with growth and macroeconomic stability and not concerned with policies. So the point here is very, very important point. If the finance minister does her or his job, then other departments have to do their job. So you can't, and that's very important. Government functions like a car, should function like a car's engine. One component does its work, another component does its work, and then together they work together. But what had been happening since about 2004, 2005, the African National Congress, the populists, and the radicals. Now, there's nothing wrong with radical, but if you have a politics of revenge embedded in that. So by 2005, the deputy president, Thabo Mbeki's deputy president, was someone called Jacob Zuma. Thabo Mbeki then fired Zuma after the courts had found that he was found convincing and overwhelming evidence that Zuma was corrupt. He didn't lose his support, but the ANC stood by him. So by 2008, September, go back to 2007. 2007, Jacob Zuma became a president of the ANC at Polokwane. If you Google Jacob Zuma Polokwane, Polokwane, this started the official rise of Jacob Zuma. He would then lead the removal of Thabo Mbeki in September 2008, and by 2009, Trevor Manuel would leave. Well, he would resign, but he would stay on as Minister of National Planning. So all of that work, integrating South Africa in the global political economy, we're starting to lose all that, starting to lose the benefits and the prospects of greater global integration and collaboration, especially with old and former and still very influential and powerful investors. Jacob Zuma would then start what we have come to refer to over 10 years as the lost decade. It was actually 9 years. But important for us to remember, political appointments, especially foreign appointments, began to be made on the basis of cronyism, patronage, nepotism. So you find that professional diplomats in the Department of International Relations and Cooperation were then ignored, and the ANC would appoint its political cadres into important positions. All the while, a new Minister of Foreign Affairs, which is Department of International Relations and Cooperation, a person by the name of Mighty Ngwana Mashabane, was appointed. Over the period, it coincides with either correlation or causation. You can reach your own conclusion. Having been close to all that, I believe it's causation. I'll give you an example in a little bit. South Africa then started losing the moral authority that it had abroad. Very many countries started seeing endemic corruption, the collapse of public institutions, and this just decline in the moral authority that South Africa had under Mandela. So Mandela's wishes and dreams virtually collapsed in that period. But they paid, that's in material terms, but they paid lip service to it. So you would always hear the president President Zuma make these wonderful statements about we are Africans and we have to look for the African solutions and so forth. But underneath it all and concealed rising corruption, unethical behavior, and so you have what we now know as state capture. There were foreign, this shouldn't be xenophobic, but there were, let's just focus on one family, the Gupta family, who essentially it's a very unsophisticated way of saying it, but they essentially bought the government. So, and then there was the other thing. Zuma also began to cozy up to Vladimir Putin. Russia became one of his more important allies. The point is that, and the evidence isn't sufficiently clear. We can state it a priori, and we can state it, just down the pub. But we have to look at the data and have to look at the information. But what happened is the Russians promised to build nuclear power in the country. Jacob Zuma reportedly, allegedly, saw lots of money-making opportunities for himself and for his loyalists. So the ANC became this profoundly corrupt institution, and there's so many examples where foreign money, foreign assistance, foreign aid, foreign trade deals were simply used as cash cows for the ruling party. So by the time Zuma's 9 years in office had ended in February 2018, the country, the economy was back, near collapsed. Growth had ceased. They could do no more in terms of distribution, and public enterprises had collapsed. So you have South African Airways virtually collapsed, post office virtually collapsed, the rail network virtually collapsed. So all these public-owned, it's called public institutions, or began to collapse and on various stages of collapse. So that's why you have today, the country is virtually shut down for between 4 and 8 hours a day because the electrical infrastructure, electricity infrastructure has collapsed. So there was then globally a decline in the moral authority, to the extent that Zuma, they wouldn't even invite Zuma to successive meetings, because, and then in that period, that was probably the worst period of South Africa's post-apartheid era. But and to give an example of the thorough incompetence of the foreign minister under Jacob Zuma, she was asked in July 2016. She was asked a question on Brexit in Europe. She was in Europe, and she simply said, "Brexit, we don't know about it. We saw it on television." So here you have a foreign minister who in 2016 was unaware of one of the most important developments in global politics. And that is the level of disconnect. She was in an interview with Al Jazeera once, and she was asked a very sane question, a very rational question, a very reasonable question. And she instead turned on the interviewer, who happened to be a white South African working for Al Jazeera, and said, you don't something, I am paraphrasing. She said, you will never understand the difficulties I went through as a child and as a woman. I think I still have a hole in my head from carrying water. And you think to yourself, here is a person who's supposed to lead South Africa's foreign policy and completely ignores the question. Just remember also, she was in Oslo a few years before that, and she was asked to put her bag through a scanner and she refused. So what happened was she had to, a plane was chartered to fly her to her next appointment. So there are very many of these issues that contribute to this sort of corrosion of domestic politics as they influence foreign affairs, and that is a very important. That's why I mentioned this, the paper by Robert Putnam, The Two-Level Game. All the while, the public were getting restless, the political economy was suffering, institutions were crumbling, and South Africa became very many foreign actors lost respect for South Africa, for South African leadership, and turned against South African leadership. Even in Africa, where the country was meant to provide political, economic, and intellectual leadership, and that's from a paper by, it's a generally known paper by Claude Ake and I think Makawira, Thabo Makawira, something like that. But African countries started realizing, hold on, South Africa is really not playing its role on the continent. So when South Africa was appointed to, as part of BRICS, countries like Nigeria and Egypt thought, well, we're more powerful, we're becoming more powerful and influential on the continent and globally. Why was South Africa chosen? The point was South Africa was chosen because of its strategic relations with Russia, because of the perceived moral standing of the country because of Nelson Mandela. But remember, all of that had been wasted. So here you have now, we've come to the appointment then of Cyril Ramaphosa in 2018, right? We just recover again, 1990 to 1994, Mandela was about reconciliation, justice, social justice and humanitarian values. He then went into government, where he insisted on reconciling human rights, social justice with developmental needs. Trevor Manuel then became the finance minister and took South Africa, integrated South Africa into global economy with a lot of positive results, but inequality continued to rise. Poverty continued and unemployment. And Jacob Zuma tapped into that and then became the corrosion. So now that takes us up to 2018. Now, all of that seems rather simplistic, but it's complicated, it's complex, and you would be well versed. I'm not, lectures are what they are. They're simply guides towards the literature, guides towards the ideas, the concepts, and the methods. By 2018, Cyril Ramaphosa came to power. Now, Trevor Manuel had, in 2012, 2013, produced a national development plan, and chapter 7 of that plan was on the South African foreign relations. But since then, the plan has just been shelved, like so many plans in South Africa. But Trevor Manuel had, by 2018, Trevor Manuel had resigned. He no longer wanted to be part of it. And Cyril Ramaphosa came to power. Now, he is a very astute business person, but so much harm was done in terms of corruption, cronyism, and patronage that it became very difficult for Cyril Ramaphosa to effect significant change in the country's direction abroad and domestically. But he began to claw back some of that moral authority that Mandela had. He began to become more serious about Mandela's objectives, Mandela's vision. But in some ways, it had become a bit too late. Things had gone so far, corruption was so endemic, we began to see the very disastrous effects of state capture, where private investors, domestic and foreign investors, had started corroding the country, and the state was completely captured. It started to resemble a criminal organization where every interaction with the state was a money-making scheme, and the common good, the justice, and the moral authority that Mandela carried really was relegated to the fringes. So where we are today then is South Africa is the country that I don't think it's a collapsed state yet or a failed state yet, but there's a lot of talk of South Africa becoming a failed state. South Africa has lost its moral authority in the world, and South Africans are not taken seriously, though we still have a presence in multilateral organizations. But with the change of political leadership in DIRCO, Department of International Relations and Cooperation, Naledi Pandor, who's the minister, Zane Dango, who is the Director General, they're starting to lead South Africa back towards where Mandela wanted it to be. Now, I mentioned the South African the Director General. If you want to get an idea of the way the ANC deployed corrupt, failed, unethical politicians and bureaucrats to foreign positions, there's a great example of the former Director General of Foreign Affairs, under that corrupt minister, Maite Nkwana Mashabane. His name is Jerry Machila. I think it's spelled Matjila. He was implicated in very serious corruption and unethical conduct. It was, reported on extensively. But instead of putting him on trial, or instead of just dismissing him from the public service and, finding an ethical, more professional replacement, he was given a very senior position in the Foreign Service. So how, you ask, does he then become South Africa's permanent representative to the United Nations after he was implicated in criminal activities, unethical conduct, and corruption, and presided over the era where South Africa lost most of its moral authority? How did he get to become South Africa's permanent representative to the United Nations? And this is the nature, this is the type of appointments that were made. All political appointments, no profession, well, very few political appointments. It was all about the ANC. It's all about money making. It's all about what I call, and what has been called by prebendalism. So the state existed only to support, fund its elites and the party members. And that's where we are now. I guess it's really. I've given some brushstrokes and I've given some insights, and you would be well encouraged to look at this up for yourself, reach your own conclusions. But the point is, South Africa, where we are today, I would conclude that South Africa has lost the moral authority that it had under Nelson Mandela, and that is much less because of South Africa's foreign relations, even though its relationship with Russia and Vladimir Putin is actually deeply problematic. You will see that, no doubt, that of the countries, South Africa, officially, South Africans have not condemned Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Now, there is that sort of developing world, global South idea of we need to reach a peaceful solution. The war must stop. And again, this is a very difficult issue. Let me just kind of sum up with this. It's a difficult issue. One of the things that Mandela did at the start, when he was recent president, is re-establish the relations with those political leaders in countries that supported the ANC, that was part of the anti-apartheid movement. And Russia, for what it's worth, is considered to be one of the old allies of the ruling party. Forget that it was the Soviet Union. So there's this sentiment. You find a lot of the ANC top leaders were actually educated in the Soviet Union, in the former Soviet Union, the GDR, and they remain loyal to Putin, to Cuba, to North Korea. So these are perceived to be left-wing organizations, and it was necessary to remain in solidarity with them. But the West continues to determine, in my harshest criticism, I say South Africa's foreign relations should not be determined in Washington or in London, because Washington says, condemn Russia. South Africa says, no, we can't just condemn Russia. We want them to sort this out peacefully. And if you don't condemn Russia, it is assumed that you support the war. And this is a conundrum. This is a difficult position South Africa faces itself in. Is how do you reconcile your values of social justice, human rights, peace building, not war, with very real grassroots African national and radical populist continued support for Vladimir Putin and despotic regimes around the world. Now, these despotic regimes, let me just say, I wrote a piece a few weeks ago in Business Day, and I gladly, is every evil empire or every evil regime we know of was so defined by Washington. So for better or for worse, South African foreign relations continues to be shaped by what Washington wants or what Britain wants than what the people of the country want. And there's a huge disconnect. So how do you go back to the time when Mandela said, Ubuntu should drive our foreign relations when the demands of the West of Europe are so strong? And this is the difficult position South Africa finds itself in at the moment. And it doesn't help that The economy is literally collapsed, and all public enterprises are on their last knees, and the country needs constant bailouts. And this is where we are. So we've gone from high growth, very low debt, GDP, strong GDP growth in the early 2000s to high deficits, approaching inflation, corruption endemically, state capture, and foreign policy that isn't quite shaped by what Mandela wanted, and it isn't also shaped completely by what Washington wants, because South Africans continue to fight back against so-called imperialism, and they remain sort of a populist revolutionary. It's actually quite right-wing. I'm writing a book on it at the moment in South Africa. So South Africa is in a difficult and terrible place domestically, in the region, and in the world. And let me leave it there, and just if there are any questions, I will gladly answer them. Thank you very much. I hope some of that makes sense.
So thank you very, very much for your. Let's. I think still, since we are recording this one, first myself and Stig will try to bring a little more attention from our perspective, and then I think we can go from there. Let me just pin how do we do this? Okay, anyway. Okay, do you see still? Yeah. Yeah. I think thank you so much for your very valuable presentation. And toward the end, I think since this course talks a little more about the philosophy, thoughts, conception, and then how that is still relevant. And toward the end, you brought this Ubuntu that in the African wisdom tradition, and also in the book, in that book that I have it here, that I have been reading, In Long Walk to Freedom, Mandela himself writes about Ubuntu as the essence of human being, and also humanity toward others, and also interconnectedness and interdependence of all human beings. And in our course, we have been learning this kind of philosophy also from South Asia, like Buddhist radical interdependence, how during that time Buddha was giving his theory of radical interdependence in statecraft and other. So now I would like to, you meant to say that it is somehow lost during all these years after this transition to democracy in South Africa. Of course, it was a historic event, but it was also a complex and challenging process that faced numerous obstacles that you have been telling very intelligently. And of course, the Nelson Mandela himself and his government achieved some notable success in terms of promoting reconciliation, social justice, and economic development. There were also significant challenges that slowed the progress and also hindered the country's development after apartheid. And if you look at some of the media and some of the other published work here and there, it talks about the legacy of apartheid was deep and pervasive, and it continued to shape many aspects of South Africa society after the end of apartheid. The inequalities and injustice created by apartheid systems such as poverty, unemployment, and lack of access to education continue to impact the country's social and economic development. And there were also, South Africa faced significant economic challenges after the end of apartheid, including high level of debt, inflation, and unemployment. The government efforts to address these challenges were complicated by global economic trend and effect of economic globalization. There were definitely, what you have also indicated, there were corruption and mismanagement was a significant problem in post-apartheid South Africa. The government struggled to address these issues, which undermine public trust and slowed progress in the areas such as economic development, service delivery, and social justice. There was also a problem of political polarization in South Africa that you have been also indicating toward that one. And also there has been other, disorienting dilemma like HIV/AIDS epidemic, and government need to focus and give emphasis on urgent versus important, the devastating effects on public and economic development toward that. So given this complexity and so on, where this principle of Ubuntu was grossly violated and by whom, in your opinion, sir?
The thing about Ubuntu is it became unfortunately became almost a bumper sticker philosophy. Everybody just threw it around without really understanding what it's like, and it was driven into the ground, and it is usually typically ignored when it comes to power relations. So I want to go back to a statement made by George Kennan. Sort of the US loves this guy. He said, he made a statement, I'll find the paragraph and I can forward it to people if they want it. He said, it was in the 1940s or 50s, he said, essentially, so the US is the most powerful country in the world. And if it wants to remain powerful, it should stop talking about things like human rights. So that is a very perversive trend when money-making and power relations come into play. So whereas in the developing world, we seek justice and sort of a non, I hate to describe people in the negative, but non-Europeans, the developing world, Latin America, Europe, Latin America, Asia, and Africa, we seek justice, we seek voice, we seek participation and a greater say in global economy, driven by notions of Ubuntu in various parts of the world, because you can find philosophical discussions on Ubuntu between Indonesia, the South Africa, Africa, and Latin America. There are variations on the theme. But the point is, for as long as the European world remained dominant, and as long as they have the economic power to say what's important and what's not. Now that's let me give you the Marxist explanation. The Marxist explanation is that people don't make their own history; they make it, it's not original, and also the ideas that prevail are always the views of the dominant class. Then let me give you a liberal, I think it's called the English School, Hedley Bull, in The Anarchical Society. Oh God, I haven't read that book in years. I think page 206. He said that effectively that the West has the power to determine what's important and what's not important in the world. So for most people in the West, even in China and various parts of the world, and somewhere in India, there is an emphasis on economics important, growth is important, finance is important, and these things are more important in some extent to human rights. And it's kind of slipped into common sense. I remember Lee Kuan Yew made a statement many years ago. He said, he said, when something like, if you're unemployed, you can't get a job, go and ask Amnesty International to give you a job, and let's see how successful they are. So it's that kind of tension. For as long as those orthodoxies remain, it'll be extremely difficult to get greater acceptance of Ubuntu.
Thank you very much. The other question that I have for you, sir, is that because there are very many places, even Nelson Mandela himself, he was writing in that comic book and other books also, that he was deeply influenced by Mahatma Gandhi philosophy of non-violence civil disobedience, and also he often cited Gandhi as one of the primary source of inspiration. What I would like to ask you is that in India also, the Gandhi became just a iconic figure or some kind of antique figure to, it's a good for decoration, but his idea about Swaraj, his idea about, Sarbodaya, that means collective or the welfare of all those ideas also are, we have seen that they didn't work so much in India, but still in very many different fronts, they have done a significant progress that we can see today. So when you are relating Gandhi and Nelson Mandela and their approach and their worldview and their vision and passion, how do you find it in your, in your thoughts, that what they have been envisioning and what is really happening?
Okay, such a very, very, very good question. One of the problems, or one of the issues in South Africa is that we are obsessed with race. So we have to turn our backs to Europe because they're the old colonizers. Turn our backs on the United States because they are the latter-day imperialists. We have to support China because they're communists. We should support Russia because they helped us during the struggle. The issue of India is very fascinating, is because there's a growing populism. Now, there's nothing wrong with populism per se, but it's a radical, extremely xenophobic, inward-looking populism in South Africa, driven by what's known as the Radical Economic Transformation Movement and the Economic Freedom Fighters. And there's a lot of scapegoating of people of Indian heritage. So you'll often find that there's a lot of hatred directed at the Indian community in South Africa. And part of that is people have started turning their backs in the last 15 years on Gandhi, because somehow people have found a statement that Gandhi made that is racist towards African people more than 100 years ago. And now Gandhi is considered to be a racist, to have been a racist, and therefore, his pacifism and its relationship with Mandela and where they meet on Ubuntu is dismissed and discarded. And so Gandhi is Indian, therefore he's racist. He's racist because he's Indian. And that is how, we're not saying now, I have a lot of respect for Dr. Ambedkar, his work on the Constitution, but there isn't that kind of depth in an analysis. There isn't that kind of understanding. The only thing that matters is Gandhi is Indian. Indians in South Africa are considered to be racist. Therefore, Gandhi is racist. And they found the statement that Gandhi made 100 years ago that was racist. So it's a very interesting discussion. And then it doesn't help that that a family of Indian nationals, the Gupta family, are at the center of all corruption, most corruption and state capture in the country. So these brothers, the Gupta brothers, have fled South Africa. They're in Dubai, or sometimes people say in Polynesia. But the point is, so you have this idea that Indian people in South Africa are racist. They have to be called out, but the racism is based largely on the fact that they were considered to be more, and I have to say this carefully, under apartheid, the whites were at the top, then the Indians, then the coloreds, people like me, and then the Africans. So in this hierarchy, you have to then look at the main target, the white people, the second target is the Indians. And because Gandhi is an Indian, he's a racist, he was racist, and you can't be trusted. So it's this difficult thing about racism that we continue to hang on to. As I said, it has nothing to do with the marvelous work that Dr. Ambedkar did in the Constitution. It has to do with his perception that Gandhi was a racist. He cannot possibly support her or be associated with Ubuntu.
But anyway, there are very many writings that we can see about how they were their approach, and in terms of non-violence, both Gandhi and Mandela were strong advocates of non-violence as a means of achieving social and political change. Also, when it comes to international solidarity, both Gandhi and Mandela recognized the importance of international solidarity in their struggle for justice and freedom. And also, there are both were, I think, lawyers, as far as I know. But sir, there is other thing, because Nelson Mandela, his approach to international relations was based on principle of human rights, democracy, and multilateralism. While his approach was widely admired once upon a time and also respected, there were also some criticism of his conception, his idea, his thoughts, or you may call it theory of IR. For example, some of the critics is that there is an overemphasis on moral principle by Nelson Mandela, because some scholar argues that Mandela's approach to IR placed too much emphasis on moral principle such as human rights and democracy, and did not pay enough attention to practical consequences of such as economic interest and national security. Also, there is another critique is that insufficient attention to economic issues. And this is related to, again, previous critique. Some scholars argue that Mandela's focus on human rights and democracy didn't pay enough attention to economic issues that are critical to international relations. And also, there are many critics like lack of clarity on South Africa's role on international system and so on. For example, okay, would you please, you also have been hearing, because you were a scholar in that kind of context. What do you say to these critics, and what is your own critics about it?
Well, there's it's a matter of priorities and sequencing of policy. So what do you think is more important? The criticism from people in South Africa is so rooted by old ideological leanings of communism, anti-communism, anti-Americanism, anti-Europe, for different reasons. You know, you're opposed to the United States, as I said, you're opposed to Europe. So a lot of that has to do with that. But, you know, but then there's the reality of unemployment and job creation. And, you know, so Mandela started off on sort of a moral, political, ideological trajectory. And then as we saw that the European realities began to bite, people essentially told him, if you don't follow our blueprint in your foreign relations, in your relations with us, and that includes lowering taxes, making it easier foreign direct investment, lowering the cost of doing business. So all this sort of standard economic stuff, we will not trade with you, or we will withhold, you know, investment. So you can see withhold investment from South Africa until South African conditions are right. So that is one of the ways that the reality of what I've come across. And I'll give you a nice little anecdote. There's a Western country that told a leader who told Mandela, when we are so happy that you're released, okay, they use different terms, that we will give you free access to our market in widgets. And everybody was happy, Mandela was happy, that political leader was happy. But when that leader went back to his home country, the manufacturers in that sector said, hold on, you can't just give away things. You haven't discussed it with us. We can't just give our widgets away. We have to make profit. We have to produce, and so there are those contradictions. So a lot of the criticism is necessary, but it's insufficient. Yes, Mandela's government did focus disproportionately on social issues globally and less on economic issues. But that was certainly corrected, as it were, when Mbeki and Trevor Manuel and Tito Mboweni at the Reserve Bank began to shift South Africa to a more conservative, not conservative, just more to the middle. So to the extent that South Africa became a liberal democracy with very strong social democratic tendencies. So the correction, the criticisms are valid, but they're insufficient, which people should think about it because it's very complex. You raised the point of in your opening remarks of the multifaceted problems in South Africa. And that's precisely it. It resembles, if you undo a rug, you have all these little strands. So there are all these little strands that you can pull out of South African foreign policy, but you were have been quite unable to pull them together into one thread. And this is one of the problems we see. One of the problems, which is a domestic problem, is that various different various government departments each work in their own direction. So, you know, the health ministry wants to talk, Ministry of Health, Department of Health wants to talk to the Ministry and Department of Health in, let's say, Norway. And then the foreign ministry says, no, you should come through us. And, you know, housing and the same. So there are those tensions, and that coherence is seriously lacking in there.
Definitely, and also some other scholars argue that his failure to challenge the global order, you know, and like his approach to international relation may have been too much focused on working within the existing global order rather than challenging the deeper structures of power and inequality that underpin it.
Yeah.
What do you say?
Well, it's absolutely correct. But so we are, I mean, this is nothing new and might be for your students, but we are in that interregnum where, you know, the old order is not quite dying and the new one hasn't quite born. And that's a very sort of Gramscian analysis, which, you know, I subscribe to. But the point is that China, the point at which China joined the World Trade Organization was a signal that China didn't want to replace the post-war liberal international economic order. It wanted to be part of it, exactly the same as Russia. So people opt into the system, opted into the system to be part of it and not to replace it. I'm sorry. So the point is, at what point do you start changing the system? And this is the tension. So you don't. So the World Trade Organization, in my view, is, and there's certainly a lot of evidence for it, and even the World Bank and IMF have been captured. I call this intellectual capture. And there's a lovely little book by Raghuram Rajan called Fault Lines, where he says how, he speaks of how the White House and Washington institutions, or like the Bretton Woods institutions, were captured by a Wall Street elite. So you find that a lot of foreign economic policies in the West are shaped by what Wall Street wants, and the poor countries and developing countries have not been able to become greater rule makers in the system. And that requires very strong, courageous leadership. You know, at the moment, we're seeing some changes. The US has been the lender of last resort for many years. But there's some changes. There are countries are starting to challenge the dollar. And that's the point, is everybody still pursues the dollar. Dollar is more important. Pursuing the dollar is more important than anything else. And these are some of the fault lines in the global political economy. And people always tend to forget the power relationships. The US is still important. We shouldn't pick on them because a lot of them are like, but the West still determines what's important and what's not important.
Yes, I have two more things, then I'll give to Stig, and he will also ask something or comment something until we are recording, and I'll pause the recording and the student will ask, okay? That is how we do here. So my friend, I really was, when I was reading these different things, I also came across the concept of rainbow nation. I think that its origin are well documented in the literature of South African history and also politics. And of course, I think this idea, this phraseology or whatever, comes originally from the Desmond Tutu, but later embraced by Nelson Mandela to describe the diverse, multi-ethnic, multicultural society that South Africa could become after the end of apartheid. Now, in my native country, Nepal, which is also small country, but multi-ethnic, is different. I mean, 23 different languages, completely different kind of the worldview, also you may say it. And the founder of Nepal also say that Nepal is not mine as a king or emperor, but it is a common flower garden of different flowers that when they exist together, the garden become very, very beautiful. This idea is still relevant, right, in very many different countries and South Africa. What is your take on this?
It's a leading question, and I actually think it is the most important thing in South Africa at the moment. I'm busy doing early research for a book on the rise of what I describe as a early 21st century fascism in South Africa. I hope to take time off later this year to finish the book. I've written extensively on it. But what has happened, if you look at the Constitution of South Africa, 1996, is a very secular, democratic constitution. Then you look at Thabo Mbeki's speech, and this is a very important speech. If you want, your students would like to just Google this speech, "I am an African" by Thabo Mbeki. Mm-hmm. So that basically sets the tone for what Mandela wanted. He said, we must start thinking of ourselves as Africans, notwithstanding the apartheid legacy of classifying someone as colored and Indian and other color and white and black. But as soon as Jacob Zuma came to power, there was a retribalization of politics in South Africa. So people began to take pride in their ethnic and racial identities. The Zulu, nobody should deny people their heritage, or it's up to them. But the unintended consequence of pride in one's nation or one's ethnicity or one's race or one's religion leads to, this is the toxic part of identity politics. Identity politics isn't necessarily bad, but when it's used as a weapon, sort of insider-outsider politics, that's when it becomes a problem. So what's happening is identity politics entered South Africa, retribalization has entered South Africa. So today you find a rise in people wanting to reassert themselves as colored. People might not understand that colored people are generally those of us who are not of European heritage, and mind the way I look, and not indigenous African. So we may have been here around for 300 years as mixed race people, but because the economic benefits and money making and pecuniary gain has accrued to mainly Africans as part of African nationalism, very many people who are in minorities are starting to feel, how do we get a piece of this pie? Because if Black economic empowerment, and if affirmative action focuses on Africans first, second, Indian third, mixed race people, colored people, so people are starting to feel aggrieved. People are starting to say, what is this rainbow nation? This rainbow nation was just, all of us singing Kumbaya and dancing around the fire. And it means nothing because the people who consider themselves more oppressed are the mixed race people, rural African people, Indian people, even though the Indian people have been very prosperous. But it doesn't help that when a person of Indian heritage a few years ago applied to go to a medical school. She had top grades, and she was told, sorry, there's no quota for Indian people, it's only for African people. So that kind of stuff continues to blight, and it's a long way from that idea of a rainbow nation, which it was something said in spontaneity at a moment of great excitement, but it still hasn't materialized precisely because of things like remember, South Africa has the African National Congress has retained the racial classification of the apartheid state and has built a sort of a sliding scale of benefits and privileges. So you get a person like the former Secretary General of the ANC, Jesse Duarte, who passed away a couple of years ago, who told someone, they have no right to ask for freedom because they didn't fight for it. So automatically you see, okay, hold on. So people who fought for it in the African National Congress and Africans have a greater right to claim freedoms and justice than do people of mixed race in India. So that kind of re-racializing, re-tribalization of South African politics, which has basically killed the notion of a rainbow nation, and Thabo Mbeki's sort of speech of I am an African. And that is one of the big problems in South Africa at the moment.
Thank you very much. Lastly, I myself being a natural scientist, but when I was looking at the different books on IR, I have to know what is constructivism, what is liberalism, what is realism, what is all these kind of themism here and there. So I just wanted to verify you that Mandela's advocacy for non-violent resistance, his promotion of human rights and democracy, and his emphasis on reconciliation and forgiveness can be understood through constructivist lens. What do you say?
Yes, oh, absolutely correct. But I'm not a constructivist, but I know some of the literature. But it has to be. We have to weigh it up between what they call the discursive element and the material element. So I'll give you an example I'm thinking of at the moment. One of the problems we have in South Africa is the failure of what's called non-racialism. Now, non-racialism actually tells us that we're all equal and we shouldn't think about race. Except when I go and apply for a job now, many people like me, the very first thing we have to do is state what race we are. And that then becomes a way of determining whether I get the job or not. So there has been criticism of people of African descent who get jobs and then fail at the jobs. But you have to support them because they're one of us. So there's that kind of policies. Those kind of policies have been very destructive. And we cannot abandon the idea of a common universe, common humanity. We cannot abandon the idea of the common good. But it doesn't help when you are told every day we're told two things. You're non-African and Africa belongs to the Africans. So where do you find your home? Where do 5 million people in South Africa go to if they don't belong? And these are some of the tensions in South African politics at the moment.
And again,
I started working on a book on that, and I sent Stig an email. I don't know if he's seen it yet, but yeah, let me leave it there.
And again, the Mandela's advocacy for democracy and human rights, as well as his focus on economic development and poverty reduction, can be seen as consistent with the liberal or liberalism principles.
Yes, it is. It is outwardly. It is. It has been co-opted into and accepted by various means of coercion and consent, the post-war liberal international economic order. So the point is, if you want to become part of the World Trade Organization, you have to accept certain policies. If you want to retain your position in the UN system, you have to accept, the principles and of the post-war liberal international economic order. So yes, it's liberal in that sense, but domestically, South Africa has some social democratic values, which have some good results. And in the region, South Africa has also promoted African identity and searching for African solutions. But one of the negative outcomes, and this is a personal, I mean, I often try not to give my deeply held personal views, but the one bad thing that is coming out of South Africa at the moment is it's these what's called the radical economic transformation. It's called African chauvinism. I call it a ethno-nationalism of a particular kind. Is that Africa is the belief that Africa should decouple from the global economy, and that I think is deeply problematic. It is essentially saying we should stop relying on Europe and the West or Asia to invest in our countries because they set conditionalities, which is all true, but two things can be true at the same time. So if you turn your back on foreign direct investment that is not from Africa, you have a problem, because African countries can't invest in South Africa when they have pressing domestic problems themselves. How do you ask a country like Somalia? How do you ask a country like Liberia to replace Germany or France or China as investment in South Africa? And these are some of the difficulties we have.
And also, while I think Mandela was critical of some aspect of realism, such as its emphasis on the power politics and also militarism or military force, his advocacy for a strong and independent South Africa can be understood through a realist lens. What do you say about that?
It's certainly true to an extent. As I alluded to, in the first 4 years after his release and then became president, he emphasized two things, and you know, it's a very conventional thing. Is I think what Robertson wrote about the double sovereignty, the twin sovereignty. You know, you respect and give us the recognition as a sovereign, independent country, same as every other country in the world. That's one sovereignty. Then there's the internal sovereignty. We then, as an independent country, can determine our own politics and policies. So that was an emphasis, but not forgetting, and this is the highly romanticized, that we are Africans first, and our African brothers, quote unquote, stood with us during the struggle because they're Africans and we're Africans. So our first loyalty is to other Africans. So you're essentially saying we love Africa, which is absolutely true and necessary. We are Africans first, but we will accept the money from the West and Europeans because that'll help us grow. So it's this really difficult situation. It's about the African identity, but the reality, and this is the realism that you talk about, of being seen to be friendly with the West, and of the more radical forces to be seen to be loyal to Putin and Russia because they helped us during the struggle, and to China because they're communists, and you know, the communists help us in our struggle. So it's this difficult playoff between, I think realism in the sense that you mentioned certainly dominates. Constructivism helps us to understand it a lot better. And my personal view is that critical realism should help us to undermine it, identify the irreconcilable differences and antinomies in South African foreign policy. The contradictions are fantastic. You know, the imminent contradiction in the policies are quite something to behold.
Thank you, Stig. Now wake up, and over to you.
Wake up. Wide awake.
Ismail, you know, my kind of questions goes in two directions, because I know you're keen interest in international political economy. And one of them is a pure political economy question, but you kind of touched upon it already. Now we see that, you know, Saudi Arabia is leaving the dollar in its trade with China. We see that Turkey is leaving the dollar with its trade with China, and others. We see that France is moving in that direction. So I never asked you if you were ascribing to Koch's thesis on the Americans' economic strength. I do suspect that you do. So is this the challenge to American hegemony? Is that what's happening now? It's since you started to touch upon it, since you have supposedly US allies letting down the United States on the dollar, basically. And you're saying that you have to kind of adhere to the liberal world order in the economic sense in order to be a part of the game, you know, to fulfill some of the Western demands, where you really have a point. But the question is, will this, although China ascribed to this liberal world order, would then nevertheless this rivalry open up for some kind of alternative niches within the international system, because you can play upon rivalry? So I'm most interested in the first question, actually, Ismail.
Let me start following. China is part of the post-war as opted into the system, but China, there's an interesting battle on at the moment now. Don't look at my work; mine appears in Business Day. But Branko Milanovic has written an excellent essay on the two capitalisms that are coming into contest. You know, there's the liberal capitalism of the West, and then there's the state-led capitalism of the East, of China. So I think that tension should bring out something new. And I hate to use the word dialectic, but that dialectic tension should produce something new. I cannot recommend that paper enough, although it's very much in the sort of liberal internationalist tradition. Branko is a brilliant economist, and I believe he's absolutely right. And the evidence is there that China is becoming gradually more involved. Actually, it's almost passé in global political economic matters and geostrategy. The thing about the dollar is, I was asked to comment recently on a paper on television, actually, on the alarmingly low levels of foreign currency in Africa. So the conventional wisdom is that you get foreign currency through trade, tourism, and remittances, and that's all been in decline. In the meantime, while the dollar supplies are decreasing, and in this global shift from west to east, people are trying to find different lenders of last resort. Let me use that very carefully. So instead of relying on the dollar, let's start thinking about Chinese, Russian, probably even Indian currencies to try and replace that. But it's all part of survival. It's all part of reducing the influence and the dependence on the United States. Now, I think it'll take 20 or 30, maybe 50 years, and I don't do predictions, for the dollar to no longer remain the lender of last in the reserve currency. The euro should challenge and replace the dollar as the US declined. Remember, the US has two sources of power left. One is military, and the other is the dollar as the global reserve currency. Domestically, the US is coming apart, and there's Christopher Coker, Gideon Rachman, and various other people have noted that the decline of liberalism started in the United States. So you're certainly, as a descriptive intervention, as a descriptive statement here is, yes, there is a decline in the role of the dollar, but the US will not let go of its power, of that power. And remember, if you look at hegemonic stability theory, you need to have a strong economy, you need to have the will to create the system and support the system and enforce it, and you have to have a military. Now, the US is starting to lose its soft power, it's starting to lose its influence, but it hasn't started losing its military might. And that is one of the tensions with Africa. So it certainly is the route ahead is going to be difficult. But as you pointed out, Turkey, some African countries, Chinese and Russians are starting to think, and Iran. Now, why must the US apply sanctions to us and ask us not to use its money when Russia wants to help us, when China wants to help us. So it's that kind of needs-based and necessary. And how do you navigate your prosperity, your search for prosperity and stability, when the lender of last resort has so much power and the ability to withhold its funds? And that's really what's driving it at the moment.
Yeah, I would like to add and challenge you a little bit, Ismail, because you might say that the dollar is very important because of, I think the argument of Cox, and which was kind of true, is that because you have these running budget deficits all the time in the United States since the Vietnam War, and you had also the deficit on the trade balance, and that this was kept by the standing of the dollar internationally. But there are two alternative hypotheses. One of them is not that important, but another one is highly interesting, and that is basically American leadership on research and development, that you need to invest in United States, and that consolidates the dollar because they are so far ahead in research and development. So I wonder what you think about that.
One of the I cannot possibly disagree with that. It's very accurate. But the US, we talk about US being in decline now and China rising, but the US has been in decline since the 1980s, not because of there was the 1990s were a time of great optimism for the US, and things were going well. They just believed they've just won the Cold War, so they, and liberal, and as Frank Fukuyama said, that liberal capitalism won, and the last man standing is a liberal capitalist. But but that optimism was followed by in 2001, the attacks on 9/11, and then again 2008 with the global crisis. So there's been a decline in U.S. confidence, and to be counteracted only with U.S. Military might. And just bring 2 points here. One is Samuel Huntington, and one is Thomas Friedman, which characters are not very reliable characters. But Thomas Friedman, Samuel Huntington wrote somewhere that the power of ideas and the way that it's accepted around the world is not because of the strength of ideas, but because of the strength of our military. Thomas Friedman, he wrote famously that the success of McDonald's is not based on McDonald's safety, but it's because in that soft white glove of U.S. diplomacy is a hard military hand of U.S. military. So it is, and that's the one sort of immediate response. But then in my intellectual, I always think of the long run. So I think that the transition began in the 90s, and we're not quite there yet. So we are in this vacuum where there are competing powers, like in the in trade, investment, global finance, because you must remember a lot of the crises we've been going through since, let's say, the Mexican crisis of 1994 to the current crisis we're verging on bank started in the United States. They all these crises start in the United States. And if you want to go back to the early 1970s, there have been at least 144 banking and currency crises in the world. A lot of it has to do with the instability. Okay, we can say with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, but it started in the United States. So these crises start in the United States and they bleed into the world. And that is the greatest challenge for us. I don't, who was it? I think Robert Gilpin wrote War and Change in Politics says, structural systemic change always follows a war, a major conflict. So we need to be careful to look at least observe that carefully. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's what's interesting with this moment. I really like your idea. You have to watch the longue durée. But the moment now is filled with paradoxes, because the United States alliance system in the Middle East has, as a consequence of Ukraine, unraveled in literally. So United States asked Saudi Arabia, which is supposed to have been their ally since 1944, to evict Russia out of OPEC Plus, and Saudi Arabia say bluntly no. And United States ask Israel to deliver Iron Dome to Ukraine, and Israel says bluntly no, or not bluntly. They say we pity Ukraine, but we won't do it anyway. And then they tried with China with the yuan, and then even France now is moving towards it. So it seems like there's some kind of dynamics that you didn't see before. Maybe I'm overestimating it, but
no, you're absolutely correct. I think you're absolutely correct. I like the part of we didn't see that, because we're so fixated with superpower rivalries, with strongman politics, with these meta discussions. I'm guilty because my personal interest is in global capital, that we seem to forget, or we can't find a place intellectually when we should, of precisely Saudi Arabia's shift and the developing relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, remember, on religious terms and socially, those two countries are really chalk and cheese. But I discovered, I just spent some time in Southeast Asia, and I asked someone quite specifically in Singapore about to explain Singapore's foreign relations, and they summed it up like this. It says, for our security, we look to the United States. For our economy, we look to China. And that's what I think is happening in Saudi Arabia as well. They're just hedging their bets.
The question is if it will be acceptable for the United States. That's the interesting question. Is it possible?
It is how the United States will respond to that. That's, I think, the important thing.
Yeah, and that's it's a fascinating question. But I also wanted to ask you about something else. We talk here about the way that Nelson Mandela was thinking and Ubuntu. And when we planned this course, we had some discussions there, Ismail. Should we include Nelson Mandela, or should we include Kwame Nkrumah? So I wonder, how do you see Nelson Mandela's visions related to Kwame Nkrumah? I suspect Kwame is closer to your heart. Maybe, yeah.
I think so too. I think Mandela is closer. Kwame Nkrumah is more important as an African leader in the post-war period than Nelson Mandela has. But I'm a very firm believer. Now, you can either say it's Marxist, which I think Engels said that we will be very foolish to believe that the ideas we hold in our youth are eternally valid. Or you can be conservative, which is Alfred Marshall, late 18th century, wrote that every new generation will determine its future based on new information and its own conditions. So, so the point is that Kwame Nkrumah spoke at a time when the things he said mattered, when the things he said were relevant, when the things he said were important. So I get into a lot of trouble with this. If you take one of my intellectual heroes and the person who inspired me the most, Steve Biko, I always have to remind people that we actually, Ken Booth accepted this argument of mine, and I'm not very clever, but I said we need to leave room for philosophical and historical explanations. Philosophical, we need to leave room for the fact that Steve Biko might have changed his mind after 40 years. Who knows? Kwame Nkrumah might sing a different song today. And the other thing is, Steve Biko and Kwame Nkrumah aren't here to defend their views. So we need to actually remember those two things. Karl Marx is no longer around. He can't defend what he said 150 years ago. And we must always leave room for the fact that he may be changed. And that, I think, goes to the point. So Nkrumah certainly is a great leader, but how valid are his ideas today? How relevant are they? Because the world has changed significantly. I'm not saying his ideas are wrong. I'm just saying, what will he say today? And that's the point only.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think there are students here. And take long 3 breaths. You are in the present moment, here and now. Your breath is also happening in the present moment. Just pay attention to that. And I will read some direct quotes from Nelson Mandela, and let it just listen, just like a scenery passing cloud. Don't judge it. No elaboration, no emotional reactivity. The quotes are as follows. No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn later. They may have learned later to hate, but they can also be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to human heart than its opposite or hate. Because love and compassion is our basic innate goodness. Mandela also said that if you want to make peace with your enemy, you have to love, you have to work with your enemy. Then becomes your partner. We must use time wisely and forever realize that the time is always right to do the right. And when he was released from the prison, 27 years of imprisonment, when he walked out, his quote is like this. As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead me to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I would still be in prison. Forgiveness liberates the soul. It removes fear. Resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies. Courageous people do not fear forgiving for the sake of peace. With this word of wisdom from Nelson Mandela, great soul, I would like to thank Ismail for giving such a valuable time. Let the world flourish with peace and prosperity. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Can I borrow Ismail a little bit on the link, Bishal?